So as more colleagues join, I just wanted to say welcome everyone to the first meeting of the Women's Major Group's new monthly meeting series. You might remember we did one in the spring as well as last fall. This new meeting series is titled Until All of Us Are Free, an intersectional feminist fishbowl series. Today, we're going to talk about LGBTQI+ communities' rights. We're so grateful that you're all here with us for this important discussion. And moreover, in this meeting series, it is of utmost importance, of course, that we cultivate the safe space, centering the demands, the voices, the analyses of those most marginalized in our feminist movements. We'll be looking into issues that are both, of course, very important, but unfortunately very much contested in the public realm. For this reason, discriminatory remarks, hate speech, the denial of self-proclaimed identities, anti-rights discourse, and other forms of discrimination, especially against the folks and groups speaking in these meetings, will not be tolerated. If such an incident occurs, the person will be removed from the Zoom platform after one warning. And without further ado, so we can finally get started, I'd like to pass the floor to our Europe and Central Asia co-organizing partner, Almudena Rodriguez, who will moderate our meeting today.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. And thank you so much for our amazing group of panelists being with us today. So I would like to start to make a reflection that now we are living in a context of rising and anti-rights and anti-gender movements, attacks on trans and Black lives, and also the division in the global feminist and women's movements. The Women's Major Group stand by our core principles of intersectional feminism, collective liberation, and human rights for all people, and leaving no one behind. It is a crucial moment to truly reaffirm and build our capacity in understanding and speaking about key issues, especially regarding issues of communities and peoples that are the most marginalized within the feminist movement. And also, obviously, it is also a key moment to reflect on how we can do better as an intersectional feminist collective. So sorry for my call. Unfortunately, as many of us have personally and institutionally experienced, there are growing attacks on the lives and safety of LGBTQI+ people, denials of rights, and a growing anti-rights discourse, hate speech, that aims to challenge our common struggles against patriarchy and towards gender equality and system change. So now, very quickly, I would like to remind everyone that we need a safe space for this meeting, for our meeting and for our discussion today. So we need and we want a safe space, and to ensure this safe space, we will not be tolerating any discriminatory remarks of any kind. And so the first 1 hour of our meeting will be a fishbowl discussion among our amazing speakers. And in the last half an hour, we will stop the recording so we can have an open conversation in a safe space for all together. And also, very important, as a part of this meeting series, we will also have an illustrator do graphic recordings that put together our discussion and inspirational visuals summarizing each meeting. We are very happy for this. It's a new experience for the Women's Major Group. And now, please, so without any more delay, please allow me to open up the floor and ask our panelists who will be speaking today to briefly introduce themselves, their work, and their organizations. You have 2 minutes for the introduction, and who would like to start? maybe Noeline or Gloria. The floor is yours. You have 2 minutes for your presentation.
Okay,
Hola, ¿qué
I'll
tal?
introduce.
Muy buenas tardes.
Yes, you go, you go.
Hola. Hola, ¿qué tal? Muy buenas tardes. Yo soy Gloria Cariaga, coordino la Fundación Arcoiris y he estado trabajando en los espacios intergubernamentales desde inicios de los 90. Me identifico como una lesbiana feminista, soy una psicóloga social, trabajo en la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, ahí soy profesora e investigadora, pero realmente mi pasión, mi trabajo está orientado a la defensa de las personas que son discriminadas por su sexualidad y representaciones de género disidentes. Es decir, yo soy una lesbiana feminista de tiempo completo. Realmente mi foco, mi pasión está en ese campo.
Noeline, you want to continue?
Sure, just a second. Yes, hi, Nolina Bolivo from Diverse Voices in Action for Equality, or DIVA, sometimes we're known in Fiji. Yeah, I'm a feminist lesbian, 53 years old. The collective and organization in which I work started 10 years ago, and it was a direct action response to homophobia, violent homophobia and transphobia in local and national women's sports, particularly rugby, but broader as well. So out of that initial organizing, our collective and network has really kind of grown both organically and with some planned work. And we're now a CSO, but we have a really kind of collectivist structure and process that works across a different, a number of different networks. So that includes 8 LGBTQI hubs across Fiji, but also Women Defend the Commons, which is focused on ecology and climate justice, feminist climate justice approaches, and also some work on sexual and reproductive health and rights and SOGISEC and others. And really right now, probably the biggest thing to say is we're in the middle of a really strong COVID-19 Delta second wave. So we're really working on kind of survival and approaches to hunger and other issues. So that's taking a lot of our time and attention and love. Thanks.
Thank you, Noeline. And Lucia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Udana, and I'd like to thank the Women's Major Group for having me here. And it's a big position to fill to talk after Gloria and Noeline and to be in this conversation. And my name is Luisa Vead, and I work for Outright Action International, a global LGBTI organization that is based in 8 countries. We're 30 years old. We're actually turning 31, but we're pretending, you know, nothing happened last year, so we can actually celebrate our 30th in a proper way. We work with our regional and domestic colleagues throughout the world. So we have regional teams in the Caribbean and Africa, MENA, and Asia. We also work with so many partners all over the globe. And I work for the UN team at Outright that is based here in New York City, that we follow everything related to the UN and also other multilateral spaces throughout the year, as we're the only ECOSOC status LGBTI organization that is based in New York City. So we like to stay here and focus on everything that's happening. And we try to queer every single space that we're able to. And like Gloria said, I'm a UN program officer at Outright 45 hours a week, but I'm a queer intersectional feminist, hopefully 24 hours a day. And I try to be 24 hours a day.
Yes, thank you so much, Luisa. And our last panelist, the floor is yours.
I think those are all our panelists.
Oh, okay. So sorry.
Panelists.
Okay, so sorry. So we can start with our discussion, with our meeting, and with the first question. So to start our discussion, we will open the floor with a question, and our dear speakers, please raise your hand to indicate you would like to speak, and I will be giving you the floor, and we will have 15 minutes for each question. Please consider this as a conversation among you, and the rest of participants. You can write your questions, your comments in the chat, and they will be addressed later. So to start, our first question will focus on the root causes. Is how are cis and heteronormativity, homophobia, transphobia, and transmisogyny perpetuated across UN spaces and beyond? And how does this connect to the root issues of cis heteropatriarchy? The speaker who wants to start, who wants to open the discussion, please raise your hand and I will give you the floor. Okay, Luisa, thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Almudena. I didn't know if I had to raise my actual hand or my Zoom hand. I have problems with that. And also one thing that I forgot to do during my presentation, I forgot to describe myself. So for those who can't see or are not seeing us, I am a Caucasian Latin American woman with long hair, glasses, wearing a black shirt with a white background, and my kitchen on the side that is I'm still trying to fix after a full month. So talking about that, I feel like the UN spaces have always been LGBTI phobic, and I'm going to use this word instead of using the very long, you know, biphobic, transphobic, homophobic, and so on, just to make it easier. But I'm not trying to erase everything else. It always been like that. And if you think about it, something that we always like to bring from Outright's perspective in our work in the UN is that throughout the years, we only have one General Assembly resolution that mentions sexual orientation and gender identity. And throughout all the existence of the UN, we managed to get one, and it's the one on extrajudicial executions. And even though you would assume that member states would say, hey, people should not be extrajudicially executed, we're not even talking about judicially executed by their sexual orientation and gender identity, that goes to a vote every single time it goes to the General Assembly every 2 years. So that is just an anecdote that I like to start with, because it shows how every time when we're talking about LGBTI issues, there's this whole idea that we don't exist, that we shouldn't be in these spaces. And there's this institutionalized idea that queer people are the cause of bad things that are happening, and we're very used as scapegoats a lot of the time. So as Nolene mentioned about COVID, a lot of the time in our work that we did, we saw several countries, including right now in Ghana, saying that COVID is because LGBTI people exist. So it's a very easy group to use as a scapegoat, and it's very easy for the anti-rights group to use an attack in order to attack all feminist rights, all human rights, in a way of this group that is very controversial in spaces like the UN. You know, we still have around 70 countries that criminalize same-sex relationships. We still have countries that criminalize trans identities. We only have less than 40 countries that have gender recognition laws. We still don't have, we have less than 10% of the countries that have non-discrimination clauses for sexual orientation and gender identity. So we see that this is spread out. And what we're trying to do is just show how this is, you know, when we say LGBTI rights are human rights, just like the feminist movement has said women's rights are human rights, it's the minimum. We're expecting non-violence, non-discrimination. We also expect everything else, and apologies for the ambulance, and I also expect everything else, because all human rights are applicable to LGBTI people, but we tend to see this discourse that when you're talking about LGBTI rights, you're attacking the right to religion, you're attacking the right to family. And that is super wrong because LGBTI people have a religion or not, have a family or not, and are still living our lives. You know, we don't exist within this space of LGBTI and then everything else, you know, like we still eat, we have friends, we go everywhere else. And I think that that's a very important way to start talking about it, because the way that LGBTI people are excluded from everything else is very similar, like other groups, like persons with disabilities, like Afro-descendants, and so on. That is very common. And that also happens within the UN space, but outside of the UN space as well. And I'll stop here because I know my colleagues have a lot to say.
Yes, I think, Gloria, the floor is yours. You can continue.
Sí, muchas gracias. Sí, yo identifico como dos grandes dimensiones que definen precisamente la política, la dinámica del sistema de creencias dentro de Naciones Unidas. Me parece que la religión es un elemento muy importante que tendríamos que considerar, o las religiones, y por otro lado es el predominio del pensamiento occidental. Este pensamiento occidental que coloca precisamente el binarismo de género en el centro de la construcción de las relaciones y de las definiciones de las personas. Y este pensamiento occidental es algo que es compartido por la gran mayoría y que incluso son adoptados por muchos países que no han sido incluso parte de estos procesos de definición. Pero por supuesto con la colonización tan amplia que hubo hacia África, hacia América Latina, hacia Asia, pues tiene un impacto definitivo en el cómo construimos o cómo nos miramos, ¿no? Como sociedad. Entonces, definitivamente, pues es natural, es visto como natural el que definamos al mundo como hombres y mujeres y que nos cueste mucho trabajo mirar precisamente los intersticios, lo que hay en medio de estas dos definiciones. Por otro lado, efectivamente, las religiones juegan un papel también muy importante y tienen además voces muy fuertes al interior de estos espacios intergubernamentales. No solamente con la presencia del Vaticano, que ya el tenerlo ahí como observador es un obstáculo importante para nuestros derechos, pero pues todas las voces que vienen desde los musulmanes, ¿no? Que también son voces fuertes que están ahí planteando desafíos muy importantes, ya no digamos para reconocer nuestros derechos, incluso para reconocer que existimos y que tenemos derecho a existir. Entonces, estas dos grandes dimensiones me parece que definen precisamente este modelo patriarcal en el que se definen estas jerarquías entre hombres y mujeres y precisamente desde esta mirada binaria. Entonces, yo recuerdo cuando estábamos en el Cairo impulsando la incorporación del género, y sinceramente lo digo, me costó mucho trabajo entender por qué el Vaticano y las fuerzas más conservadoras insistían en que el género tenía que ver con la homosexualidad, creando esta confusión entre la orientación sexual y el género que también está en muchos lugares y que, como decía Luis ahora, pues que incluso lo utilizaban como un elemento de alarma, de alerta con respecto a la desestabilización que el género podía traer en la inclusión de la política internacional. Entonces, hasta después que nos dimos cuenta de cómo esta condición jerárquica aparece en los libros sagrados de casi todas las religiones, en donde las mujeres siempre estamos en una condición de sumisión, pues te das cuenta el significado que para ellos tiene el que nosotras estemos apostando a la igualdad. O sea, desde los libros sagrados, la igualdad entre hombres y mujeres no es posible, definitivamente. Y me parece que con los grupos extremistas como los talibanes que estamos viendo hoy día, nos ayudan a entender esa realidad desde donde ellos están pensando, pero son reflejo de lo que piensan muchos otros en la cultura occidental. No son solamente los talibanes los que están colocando a las mujeres en esos lugares de subordinación. Son todos los que se oponen de distintas maneras a la igualdad entre entre todas las personas y al reconocimiento de la amplia diversidad social, cultural y sexual que tenemos, ¿no? Entonces yo creo que yo miraría por ahí como los principales desafíos que en estos espacios se magnifican, se expresan y que dificultan nuestro trabajo.
Yes, Noeline, if you want to continue. Thank you,
Sorry, I
Gloria.
didn't hear that. I'll continue. Thank you. So really, maybe just, I won't repeat what's been said, but what I would say is that, you know, anytime we engage with the multilateral, we just have to keep in mind that, you know, I love this quote that actually Coalition of African Lesbians, I was with them in a session years and years ago, and so one of them said, you know, the reality is that we are the global and New York and London and Geneva are the local. And the reason why that for me is not just a slogan is because everything that we're experiencing, whether it's the heteropatriarchy, you know, whether it's this ableism that we feel, whether it's the coloniality that you know, these multilateral systems are just riddled with. I mean, I hope we can get to it in a minute, how awful it is for majority South people right now who are trying to work out whether we're going to go to climate change meetings in Glasgow, when we're having to deal with the fact that, you know, there's been a deliberate set of work to keep the vaccine in rich industrial countries, and that we have been spending our time the last few months trying to make sure that, you know, that we can even access basic levels of vaccines. So if we're talking about, you know, cis heteropatriarchy, we have to really kind of work out that it's riddled all the way through everything that we do in our lives, whether it's our relationships, you know, here in Fiji, whether it's in the Pacific and how we organize, how the UN organizes. I mean, this is the other thing, is we're dealing with local offices all the time. So, and those look different, and they take on the forms of whatever is happening with the state and non-state, with religion, with non-state actors, with the military industrial complex. All of these things are welling inside and around our bodies, as, you know, as a lesbian, as a transgender person, as a gender non-binary person. So every time we go into the UN spaces, wherever they are, we're dealing with that as a minimum. And that's before we start doing all of the negotiations on social, economic, and ecological justice that are part of our reality as people. Thanks.
Okay, if any of you would like to add some reflection or some message around regarding the first questions, raise your hand and take the floor.
Yo quisiera agregar que también el concepto de sexualidad es algo que no ha avanzado suficiente. La mayor parte de las personas asocian a la sexualidad con la reproducción. Incluso yo pienso que nosotras como feministas hemos contribuido en algo en eso, porque todo el tiempo estamos hablando de derechos sexuales y reproductivos como un lema en el que fueran juntos siempre, ¿no? Y que no los podemos separar. Ha costado mucho trabajo separar los derechos sexuales de los derechos reproductivos, cuando realmente pues, son dos ámbitos distintos. Y me parece que el hecho de que trabajemos o que miremos a la sexualidad vinculada con la reproducción niega el placer como la función principal de la sexualidad. Y afirmamos de distintas maneras, o quiero decir, involuntariamente reafirmamos la idea de que el objetivo de la sexualidad es la reproducción, que es como lo plantean precisamente estas ideas occidentales y religiosas. Entonces a mí me parece que si nosotras empezáramos a hablar de la sexualidad desde otro lugar, romperíamos también con esa mirada heterosexista en donde necesariamente tienen que estar los genitales, el hombre y la mujer juntos para el ejercicio de la sexualidad, ¿no? Entonces, ahí yo creo que tendríamos que reflexionar más el cómo hemos nosotros construido, elaborado alrededor de la sexualidad y realmente cómo podemos moverla a otro margen en donde podamos desarrollar otras reflexiones, otras propuestas con respecto al derecho a la sexualidad que todas las personas tienen, ¿no? Y destacar sobre todo el placer sexual, que no le tengamos miedo a hablar de placer, de erotismo, porque muchas veces lo toman como que eso es algo liviano, que eso no es profundo y que no tendríamos por qué dedicarle tiempo a eso, cuando ese es el objeto de la sexualidad, no tiene otro, ¿no? Entonces tenemos que reconocer eso. Y bueno, por ahí lo dejo.
I think this is a key issue for people who are working on sexual and reproductive rights, and we need to reflect about this. And maybe Noeline or Luisa, would you like to add something regarding the last comment of Gloria? Because I think for us it's extremely important to reflect, because I know I don't have the answer. But I think because sometimes I think that we need to be together, not separated the agendas. But maybe Luisa and Noeline, you can add more reflections, important reflections regarding this. Thank you.
I would just really quickly add, completely, and one of the, completely agree with Gloria, but one of the things that we're seeing also specifically in our region, and I would be interested to hear in other regions too, is really deep slippages. Well, I wouldn't even call them slippages, falls in the way that we are talking about not just sexual and reproductive health and rights and sexual justice and, the kind of terms that we're using. But what we're seeing is in the Pacific, we're seeing civil society groups, feminist groups who are starting to kind of talk about sexual reproductive health. And, like there is some really kind of, there's a lack of kind of discussion about where we've come from and how much we have worked to be able to open up categories of, talking about categories of intersectionality, talking about interlinkage, being able to articulate when we are speaking about pleasure and about eroticism and about, the right to be able to self-define in terms of how we move through the world in these bodies, and bodily autonomy and integrity. That's why I was really pleased to finally see, and I just can't believe that it's taken this long for UNFPA and others to be able to come out with, a major report, the State of the World Population Report. I mean, I really encourage people to take the time to push them and to kind of engage with that report, because I think that it's taken far too long. And now what we're seeing in the Pacific is, this kind of, just like we've seen in many other issues, if we're not careful, then we start to have it kind of picked off and the low-hanging fruit we deal with. So for instance, now there's a lot of attention in the Pacific again on menstrual health issues, but rather than kind of ground that and frame that within, kind of many different issues, including how bodies move through society and different kinds of society, how they move through education systems, how we are in urban and rural areas, and talking about different kinds of bodies that menstruate, and not just getting caught again into these kind of fixed gender binary categories. We're just allowing ourselves to, to really go to we just had a resolution at the Human Rights Council where our government, for instance, I think teamed up with Cameroon and I want to say Ghana, but, like don't quote me on that. There's 3 of them that took it forward. And what was really alarming was that in our menstrual, I mean, even the words, that we're using, we've done so much work on this and we're using menstrual hygiene language. And when there's no mention of sexual and reproductive health and rights in it, when we've worked for, over 25 years on building this set of work, as Gloria said. So, and now we're playing catch up because they've already put this resolution out. And what I want to know is those who are working with us in the global feminist movement in Geneva, where was this? Did we keep our eye on it? Clearly we didn't. because it got through. And there are those who kind of focus their work on that. So part of solidariousness is making sure that when we're in these different spaces, we really are trying to make sure that we're keeping an eye on what is going into those multilateral systems, and how they're coming out as text, because text is only one thing. There are many other kinds of realities in the work we do, but text matters. It does matter because we've worked so long and so hard on language. Thanks.
Almudena, if you let me, I'll just speak for a minute or two. And I agree completely with what Gloria and Nalin said. And I was going to say what Nalin just said, that language does matter. And in a conversation like this one, it's very important, the shift also that Gloria said on what we like to call in certain South American groups, the right to joy or the right to happiness, which is not an actual written right, but it should be. But also talking about the language in this local space, as Nalin said, that is the UN. And also focusing specifically on the women's major group, thinking about the Agenda 2030 and thinking about all the language and development that we have in the UN, that it was deliberate that we have certain groups that were not part of the Agenda 2030, even though activists were there and were present and were trying to include, for instance, LGBTI populations. They were not included for a reason. A lot of the times the language that we get is not ideal, as Nalin said, within the UN space. And a lot of the times we think we have allies, and being very frank, we think we have allies within certain member states or certain spaces that already internally, domestically have wonderful language or wonderful laws or wonderful texts. And then when we come to this multilateral spaces of 196 negotiators, the language goes back to, oh, let's go back to what we agreed 10 years ago that we don't use anymore because it's so much easier for us. And now also with Zoom and everything else, there are more and more barriers of those things happening. So I think all of these issues are interconnected. So for instance, we as civil society are not allowed within the UN building anymore. And the General Assembly is going to happen. And the state leaders are going to be there and the diplomats are going to be there. So we're always having to reinvent ourselves and our activism and what we're doing, because it becomes easier and easier to push those who are already not accepted inside, using the excuses of everything else that is happening. So I feel like it's really important to have this conversation on how do we bring the global, which means all the work that has been done and is being done domestically and regionally, to these local UN spaces, that we're the ones that are already not being allowed inside, but we're trying to kick the door in some way, and not let things go back or things move towards a direction that we're not happy and we're not satisfied with.
Thanks, Luisa. If all of you are agree, and we can move to the second question. And let me ask you, the second question is different questions, more than just the second question. But what are the key demands of the LGBTQI+ activists and advocates in multilateral spaces? How can we face and eliminate the discrimination faced by the LGBTQI+ community in your context and in the international arena also? And what should be strategies for this struggle? The floor is yours. I can see your hands. Noeline, sorry. The floor is yours.
No, that's fine. Yeah, sure. So I would say the first thing about this is we are working at the very, very kind of local and vernacular. And we are dealing with issues of struggle now that are also not just about public health, but about literal bodily survival. So I think that's, you know, I can only speak for the body of work that we're doing here. So I'd like a moment sometime to talk about this issue of COVID-19, but specifically how it has an impact on various kinds of bodies, and that I don't think we are doing that discussion as helpfully as maybe we could. So that's one, but I'd like to put that aside just for a second. One of the things is that we have to be present in the various multilateral spaces. And it's very difficult to do that physically as a woman or a person who is organizing in the Pacific Small Island states, for instance. So one of the sets of struggles is, you know, is being in the thick of the negotiations. And as Andrea, I think someone just spoke now about, it's very, very hard to be in the physical space of the UN, but it's also very difficult for us to be in the faces of our governments at home right now as well. And if you're thinking about, you know, your particular context, for me, it's a region that has a high level of regionalism. So a lot of our development institutions, for better or for worse, are across 22 island states and territories. So you have that, you know, now with the borders closed, we are having to renegotiate how it is we are able to push and to pull on various sets of issues. And the struggles are so many, because we are dealing with issues of climate and ecological justice. We're dealing with issues of financing for development. We are dealing with, you know, trade sector and debt sector and debt justice struggles. And all of these are connected, and all of them are sexual rights struggles. All of them are struggles for different kinds of bodies. And for those who are intersectionally affected by these, it's about looking both at domestic and foreign policy, but even more kind of nuanced, it's about local, national, you know, we don't even have, right now, we don't even have local government in place. That was removed several years ago. So we are working on different kinds of intrastate issues, as well as we are working on issues within the Pacific, within Asia Pacific, and within the globe. So our focus has to be on what the state is doing and policies on social floors, social protection, social infrastructure, and specifically how that relates to bodies that are, you know, non-heteronormative. But we also are facing issues of violence and disenfranchisement that we've been, you know, that we've been facing since the beginnings of my particular state experiment 50 years ago, when we got independence from a colonial power. And that coloniality, you know, and the set of relationships within the Pacific, which is where you have two major settler states, and there are indigenous struggles within those in Australia and New Zealand, but we also have a genocide that's happening in West Papua. So we're dealing with those issues as much as we are with anything that we, you know, that we are doing in Fiji and in our states and territories. So I just wanted to be clear that it's always been the experience of people with non-heteronormative identities, that our experience and our relationships within the state and between states has been completely complex anyway. And that we have to be clear that any sets of strategies and tactics that we use necessarily has to change over time. We can't be pointing at each other. You know, I spent a lot of my younger years as an activist being told by certain people that I can say that, I can't do this, I can do that. And as I get older and my life praxis goes on, that one of the things we have to do better is what does what does it look like to work at an issue over a long period of time? And how do we make sure that we ourselves are equipped for that, but also that we are helping others to become and to remain and to build their equipment and skills and knowledge for that? Because I think it's really important. Whatever the state was imagined, it was never supposed to be ours anyway. So we have been in this conflictual relationship with it the whole time. But I don't think we talk about that enough. And to me, that is about issues like multilateralism, but also the Women's Major Group and how we relate to each other as activists and as human beings. Thanks.
Thank you, Noeline. And Gloria, the floor is yours.
Sí, muchas gracias. Yo creo que precisamente la pandemia del COVID, como ha señalado Noeline, nos ha traído una evidencia con respecto a los vacíos y vulnerabilidades de los sistemas en cada uno de los países. Nosotros en México, se ha hecho muy evidente la desarticulación, el desmantelamiento que tenía el sistema de salud de nuestro país, la pobreza del sistema educativo. Todo esto repercute pues en las posibilidades que la gente tiene realmente para enfrentar la pandemia y que de pronto la economía resulta como el elemento más importante para el sostenimiento del país y la salud y las personas se van colocando en segundo y en tercer lugar. Para las poblaciones LGBT, esta situación nos ha colocado realmente en una situación de crisis muy, muy grave. Yo diría que en la mayor parte de los países del mundo, la población LGBT no forma parte del Plan Nacional de Desarrollo. Los gobiernos no mencionan cuáles son las acciones que van a desarrollar para garantizar los derechos de las personas LGBT. Y esa invisibilidad que tenemos en la política pública, pues ahora durante el COVID nos colocó en una situación de vulnerabilidad realmente gravísima, ¿no? Las mujeres trans, trabajadoras sexuales, terminaron siendo personas de la calle, viviendo en la calle, porque cerraron las casas en donde vivían. O sea, fue realmente una crisis gravísima la que enfrentamos. Y los pocos recursos que teníamos se fueron desmantelando. Los espacios de reunión, los espacios de interacción, los centros comunitarios LGBT desaparecieron porque no había recursos que los sostuvieran. El gobierno ha eliminado todos los apoyos para las organizaciones sociales, imagínense. Entonces, y las organizaciones LGBT apenas empezaban a recibir algunos recursos, entonces la situación realmente nos empobreció de una manera catastrófica. Yo no logro imaginar qué va a ser de las personas LGBT cuando empecemos a construir esta nueva realidad post-pandemia, porque la situación que estamos enfrentando realmente es muy grave. En México, desde antes de la pandemia, había una carestía de medicamentos muy importante. No había abasto suficiente de medicamentos y el VIH se ha convertido otra vez en un problema gravísimo para la población. No solamente porque no hay medicamentos suficientes, sino porque donde se aplicaban las pruebas no están accesibles, las citas son a muy largo plazo. Entonces se está incrementando el problema del VIH para muchas personas, porque además otra vez la sexualidad entró otra vez a la clandestinidad. Como estábamos aislados, cada quien se supone en su casa, entonces el ejercicio de la sexualidad se desarrolló a través de las aplicaciones de ligue y de buscar lugares clandestinos en donde encontrarse, porque no había lugares de encuentro. Entonces, realmente a mí me tocó participar en una investigación para la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada en México sobre la situación específica que estaban enfrentando las personas LGBT. Y fue realmente apabullante el ver la cantidad de esfuerzos que la gente LGBT estaba haciendo para sobrevivir en estas condiciones. Y la pandemia nos trajo a develar no solamente la condición local, sino también toda esta disputa que hay con respecto a las vacunas, a la tensión que entre los países se puede tener, ¿no? Entonces, también ahí el multilateralismo, los acuerdos entre los países es un problema que no hemos acabado de resolver, que no tenemos claro sobre la mesa cómo se está jugando esas negociaciones para hacer que la vacuna sea universal y que llegue a todos los países. Porque me parece que es un desafío que todavía está pendiente para plantearse de manera seria, formal, ¿no? Entonces creo que en ese sentido, pues ahorita la pandemia nos está planteando, como decía yo, nos reveló cosas que ya teníamos, pero que no habíamos ponderado, que no le habíamos dado la fuerza o la importancia que tenía, pero que hoy nos está planteando nuevos desafíos. Entonces creo que la población LGBT va a traer nuevas perspectivas, nuevas demandas, pero que ahorita precisamente por las olas que tiene la pandemia no nos permite una organización estable, ¿no? Continua, que nos posibilite el armar una agenda sobre qué es lo que queremos. Para mí, una de las prioridades que vamos a enfrentar es la inclusión de las personas LGBT en los planes de desarrollo de todos los gobiernos. Porque si no estamos en los planes de desarrollo, vamos a seguir vulnerabilizándonos y quedándonos en los márgenes de la sociedad, reafirmando otra vez los estigmas y esta discriminación de que hemos sido objeto a través de la historia, ¿no? Entonces creo que por ahí pienso yo que tendríamos que enfocarnos de manera clara y contundente.
Thank you so much, Gloria. Maybe Luisa, do you want to add something?
Yes. So I was thinking of everything that was said, and it is so true on all that is happening. But I wanted to take one step back before taking another step forward and addressing that, as much as everyone in this conversation might know, a lot of people might not know that the requests of the LGBTI movement, which I'm not speaking in name of the movement, are different within the letters of the acronym. They are different within realities. Of course, we have things that intersect and talk, but the requests, for instance, for gay men in the US are very different than the requests for trans women in Brazil. So I just wanted to take this step back and also bring that into perspective, because it is very important for us to think about that. And bringing back what Gloria said about COVID-19 from Outright's perspective, we did a research in the beginning of the pandemic back in 2020, March, April, on the situation of LGBTI people throughout the planet in the beginning of what we thought was going to be a very quick situation that continues to exist, and we don't know when it's going to end. And the name of that report is Vulnerability Amplified, which I think our research advisor was very intelligent to choose, because what we found throughout the world in that moment, as Gloria also said, is that no country that was creating a response to COVID-19 thought about including LGBTI policies or specific clauses in their responsive plan. So in that moment, what was happening was a lot of responses that quote unquote were neutral were not neutral, and they were affecting different populations differently, and they were specifically affecting LGBTI people. And I say it in the past because I'm mentioning the report, but we see that this continues to exist throughout the globe. And it's very hard because we see that there was no financial support, but there was also no human support, and there was no planning support. So we see histories repeating again and again. So everything that was mentioned by Gloria, by Nolene, has happened in other places to other LGBTI groups, to other LGBTI people during COVID-19, which just showed this vulnerability that already exists, and it was already created by states and other stakeholders to LGBTI populations. And that's also, well, this is another story that we can talk in another moment. That's also why we created a fund, because we saw that there was a lack of funding also from member states for what was happening for LGBTI groups, even for food and hygiene and so on. But another thing that I wanted to add, and within the creation of allyship and everything else, that as I said, and I talk a royal we of outright, we don't speak for the movement, we're part of the movement, and that's why we work in coalition. And that's also why my colleagues were also saying that it's important that this conversation is always happening, and it's always happening globally, and it's always happening with those who are doing work on the ground, and those who are doing work in multilateral spaces, and those that are doing work in all of those spaces at the same time, because it is important that we work together, not only within the LGBTI groups, but also with different groups, and also conversations like this one that we're having, because we know we are part of the feminist movement, and we see a push against us participating in the LGBT and the feminist movement, but we are part of the feminist movement. And we also, I saw that Francis put some comments in the chat. We have older LGBTI people, we have young LGBTI people, we have LGBTI people with disabilities, and we have a lot of allyship that should also be working together in the spaces for LGBTI rights, because it shouldn't be just LGBTI people pushing for LGBTI rights all the time. It should be something that works together, and we gain more strength and traction together. And I wanted to add that.
Thanks, Luisa. And regarding this, I think our last question, and Gloria, sorry, you want to add something regarding this question. So the floor is yours, please.
Sí, gracias. Sí, yo estaba pensando en la última parte de la pregunta que nos planteaste, que tenía que ver cuáles serían las estrategias para esta lucha. Y ahí me parece justo, tal vez con lo que estaba diciendo Luisa, que como sabemos, el cuestionamiento al género se va ampliando cada vez más. El movimiento antigénero va creciendo de una manera realmente impresionante, ¿no? Lo que está aconteciendo en España, en Estados Unidos, de pronto empieza a crecer y está abarcando muchas otras regiones. En México, como en América Latina, también está teniendo una fuerza en las últimas fechas muy importante, no solamente de parte de los grupos religiosos conservadores que nosotros vimos aparecer con la ideología de género que empezaron a desarrollarse hace unos años, pero ahora con algunos sectores del movimiento feminista que se niegan a reconocer el género como una dimensión feminista, como una aportación feminista para realmente avanzar en la igualdad de todas las personas. Entonces, estos movimientos me parece que también son movimientos que vienen a desquebrajar, a poner en riesgo los pequeños logros que habíamos alcanzado. Y que incluso económicamente, yo decía, los grupos, las organizaciones LGBT reciben financiamiento de manera en los años muy recientes. Y son pocos los recursos para los cientos de organizaciones que demandan apoyo, como Luisa ha tenido la experiencia, ¿no? Entonces yo creo que ahora estamos disputando esos pocos recursos para quienes se contraponen con el reconocimiento de nuestros derechos, para el reconocimiento de una forma nueva de nombrarnos, de identificarnos. Entonces yo creo que ahí esos movimientos llamados feministas transfóbicos han sido muy vocales, han tenido una voz muy fuerte, muy constantes en su lucha, y a mí me parece que el movimiento feminista inclusivo, ¿no? Este movimiento al que nosotros pertenecemos, tendría que tener voces también mucho más claras para afirmar su postura, su posición, que muchas veces pues no estamos de acuerdo con lo que las otras dicen, criticamos lo que las otras dicen, pero no hemos sido lo suficientemente vocales para poder plantar qué es el feminismo, qué es lo que el feminismo está buscando, cómo el feminismo realmente lo que busca son todos los derechos para todas las personas, defender la interseccionalidad, defender el género como una herramienta muy importante para la comprensión de la sociedad y para la igualdad. Entonces yo creo que necesitamos nuevos discursos tal vez, o reafirmar los principios y discursos que ya teníamos, pero hacerlos visibles, hacerlos que se escuchen mucho más frecuentemente, porque me parece que también ahí estamos dejando vacíos en donde las otras voces están ocupándolos, ¿no? Y eso me parece también muy riesgoso.
Yeah, completely agree. This is one of the key issues, the division of the feminists. But as far as we know, in Spain, there's the institutional feminism, completely different from the international feminism. But we know that this kind of feminism is receiving money from the anti-gender groups and the fundamentalism groups. Why? The problem in Spain is incredible, like in other parts of the world, like in your country also. But how can we overcome this issue? How can we be together? Here in Spain now, right now, it's completely impossible to be together and to find ways of working in a collective way with the institutional feminism. We are so sorry for this, but in a war. So how can we work and to define strategies to overcome this problem and to be united in front of these anti-gender and anti-rights movements? So if Noeline or Luisa, would you like add something regarding this? And no? Okay, yes. Noeline, okay.
I mean, I would just say that, you know, I'm not going to speak directly to any context, but except my own in the Pacific. And one of the kind of sets of work that it's taken 10 years, you know, for us within one set of organizing spaces in Diva for Equality to really gain enough kind of strength and internal strength to be able to put forward ideas that are, you know, helpful in kind of real and lucid ways to push ourselves and to help to push others to do you know, intersectional, interlinked and sets of work that are focused on liberation on all territories and speaking about liberation of body as part of that work. And that we have taken strength from sets of work across the globe, including in Latin America in this set of work, right? So in order to be able to stand strong in what for us is really kind of complex, small social space that can turn on a dime, you know, with high levels of, you know, like when I think about the kind of work within which I find myself here in the Pacific, we've still got six states that criminalize same-sex relationships, and they do it on a binary basis. Often it's the sodomy laws, but in a couple of the places it's also, you know, lesbian relationships as well. So those kinds of basic sets of work that we have to do on decriminalization are still very much present with us. And then you have to deal with kind of coloniality, hyperdevelopment, and, you know, the heteropatriarchy and Judeo-Christian sets of, you know, work that have been there for millennia. So one of the things that we've been kind of committed to from the beginnings, and we had in the early days, we had both human rights and feminist groups that would say, you know, why is a LGBTQI-led group speaking on economics? Why are you trying to have a position on ecology or climate justice? What's your business in there, and isn't it taking you from the real work? You know, why are you interested in unpaid care and domestic and communal work? And why are you going to fisheries sector meetings? Why does deep sea mining have anything to do with you all? So even just kind of making, and ourselves being able to make those positions clear to people was a set of work. And now that we feel, you know, that we have some of that argumentation in place and we have some of those tactics and strategies in place, and we're still working on them, that you know, one of the key things that we speak to about people is we insist on being subjects in every area of our lives, that it is about the complicated, messy intersecting of both identities and issues and ourselves as bodies relating with other species, that all of that is about being human in this particular place and time, and how we deal with the justices and injustices in which we find ourselves. So that kind of the sets of work, you know, like if we're talking about like what we've tried to practically do about that, that's a long conversation and time is going. But, you know, like on organizing, one of the things we can say is that at the moment, in particular countries like in Fiji, we're not actively targeted by the state right now, as we were in the 1990s and early 2000s. We've had a couple of wins in, you know, legal precedents, but really on a long, you know, on what we really require, no, these are very contingent gains, and we know that. And we know that any new government coming into place, we have a strong constitution, so that set of work is good. We have a Bill of Rights where we have a specific non-discrimination clause relating to sexual orientation and gender identity, but not expression and sex characteristics. We have an anti-discrimination clause, and we use that every day, including now in COVID-19, in order to be able to work with the framework of the current government and say, we expect and insist on those protections. Does it always work? No, but it's a hell of a lot better than even 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Then we also have a 5-year national action plan to end violence against, now here we go again, violence against women and girls. So we then have decided still to enter and be one of the technical working group partners, because for us it's important to keep breaking and building and saying, no, but it's also about gender non-binary bodies, and no, but it's also this. And so if we sat aside and completely didn't enter, then we would have a problem, you know, in influence. So there's always those complications about whether you enter the spaces. None of them are ever ideal, but we still keep moving those. We have 8 organizing hubs. We're on technical working groups for various things. Sometimes they're completely useless. Sometimes they're a little bit useful, and sometimes they're incredibly useful. And we can see how we can move that work over time. On the regional level, we have these ridiculous declarations that have been made, you know, over the last 30 years in our region, but we're on a review committee. Finally, we got a lesbian on the review committee. It's taken us a damn long time, but at least we are getting to the stage where, you know, there's some good news. Otherwise we'd fall in a heap. Taken us the longest time to do that. We have sessions on SOGISEC that we insist on doing from a feminist frame, and we're doing them with academic institutions, with police, with corrections facilities, and next year we're going to focus on the parliament. We're coming for parliamentarians. We're not going to get to everybody, but at least we can try and see where we can move some of that work. And I would say we're also doing some of the work on the difficult things that feminists often find difficult in our civility politics. We're as bad as anyone else in this. We have to talk about skin color politics in the Pacific, and we have to talk about how hyper-developmentalized and, you know, technical the way that we deal with human beings is. And we're trying to do some of that work and bring others with us to do that. The decoloniality praxis that we're trying to do right now, you know, on anti-nuclear work, you know, there's 153 nuclear tests. Those are in the bodies, including of LGBTQI people. So how can it not be our issue, and how can it not be a women's major group issue? And that's maybe the last point that I'd make is one of the interesting things is we had someone we love actually from the women's major group who kind of invited, like welcomed lesbians into a space, and we were like, we are already here. We don't need to be welcomed. We have been here with you from the very beginnings. We have helped to create the women's major group. So please don't welcome us. Like, you know, please don't do that, because it is about solidarious action that we have built over a long time. Some of us that have not been able to be, you know, public about our sexuality because of what will happen to us when we go home, and others of us who take on that load. So I think it's also about how we demonstrate. We talk a good game of until all of us are free, but it's a whole other set of work when we start to put that into practice, and to put it into practice over time, and to then work out what that looks like to do that at all of the levels of work that all of us are doing with such, you know, with such enormous effort. And I think I'll finish with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Noeline. I completely agree with you that lesbian women have been always inside of the women's major group from the beginning, fighting, working, and yeah, always. It's completely true. Thank you so much. So please let me move to the last question. It's very similar, but we can go on deep for the other. So how can the global feminist movement, and also specifically the women's major group best support and center LGBTQI+ people, folks, and our collective struggles for liberation? Gloria, I see you raise your hand, so it's your turn. Thank you.
Gracias. Bueno, miren, yo diría, lo primero que tendríamos que hacer es que hay que sacar la sexualidad del closet. O sea, la defensa de la libertad sexual de las mujeres se levantó por las feministas en los años 70. Y yo no sé cuándo la volvieron a meter en el cajón. Parece que nosotras, las lesbianas o las personas LGBT, las trabajadoras sexuales, no somos las dueñas de la sexualidad. Todas ustedes tienen sexualidad. Entonces, ¿a qué horas vamos a discutir sobre sexualidad? En serio. Aparte de lo tradicional que hemos venido trabajando. Realmente hablar, ¿qué pasa con la sexualidad? Y con todos los temas que estamos trabajando, porque la sexualidad es una dimensión que nos acompaña a todas partes, igual que el género. O sea, el género y la sexualidad son dos dimensiones que van caminando junto con la gente desde que nace hasta que se muere. Entonces, va a estar presente en todos los procesos sociales en los que estamos trabajando, estamos estudiando. Y yo creo que necesitamos sacarla, develarla, ponerlo ahí en la discusión, cuando estamos hablando de cambio climático, de extractividad, porque la única manera como se representa y cuando a veces le damos alguna importancia es cuando se convierte en un problema. La violencia sexual, ¿no? Pero me parece que cuando estamos realmente en el ejercicio pleno de nuestra sexualidad, no se considera, pareciera que no existe. Y en ese sentido es que yo digo, tenemos que sacar a la sexualidad del closet y ponerla en la mesa para la discusión. Eso a nosotros nos ayudaría, por supuesto, porque mucho del estigma que nosotros cargamos tiene que ver con el hecho de que nuestra sexualidad no es reproductiva. Y que entonces nos miran como algo perverso, como algo dañino, ¿no? Como algo amenazante, cuando realmente la mayor parte de la sexualidad que el mundo ejerce es no reproductivo, que lo que buscamos todos es el placer sexual. Entonces yo creo que ahí tendríamos que ver cómo hacemos para incorporar la sexualidad en los debates que estamos teniendo. Que en cualquier debate que estemos teniendo nos preguntemos, ¿y la sexualidad cómo está ahí? ¿Cómo opera la sexualidad en ese espacio? Eso me parece como un punto fundamental que nos ayudaría a romper con el estigma que nosotros tenemos. Por otro lado, y relacionado con lo que estaba diciendo Noeline ahorita, creo que muchas de las lesbianas feministas que participamos en estos grupos, en el Women Mayor Group, en los distintos grupos del Women Mayor Group, nos enfocamos también de manera decidida en la defensa de los derechos de las mujeres y no se nos mira realmente como lesbianas y que incluso pues el caucus LGBT que camina por su lado no va incorporando esto. Es decir, nosotras estamos invirtiendo permanentemente en la defensa de los derechos de las mujeres en distintos ámbitos. Pero eso no se refleja ni en el caucus LGBT, ni necesariamente impacta una nueva mirada, esta mirada de las lesbianas en el Women Mayor Group. Cuando ahorita estaba diciendo Noelín de la bienvenida que se da a las lesbianas, yo creo que tiene razón Noelín al decir bienvenidas, pero que esa sorpresa de incorporación de las lesbianas es porque no estamos en la cabeza de las personas. Sí estamos presentes ahí, físicamente estamos ahí, pero nuestros issues no están en la agenda. Y por eso no estamos bienvenidas. Necesitamos ser bienvenidas. Y que realmente el asunto, los asuntos LGBT formen parte de la agenda del Women Mayor Group. Que no necesiten que estemos todas, que estemos en todos los espacios para estar reclamando que ahí estamos y que se nos considere. Que se considere nuestra situación, estoy refiriendo. Claro que estamos presentes desde hace mucho tiempo, desde siempre, en el movimiento feminista, pero el movimiento feminista no necesariamente retoma los desafíos y las necesidades de las personas LGBT. Y ahí es donde tendríamos que pedir esa bienvenida a nuestras necesidades, a nuestros temas, ¿no? Creo que tendríamos que considerar, y ahí sí lo digo como feminista, creo que el movimiento feminista se ha caracterizado mucho como un movimiento académico o con un respaldo académico muy fuerte. Y que ese respaldo académico es lo que ha dado la posibilidad para que el movimiento feminista sea tan fuerte y tan amplio que puede discutir cualquier tema. A mí me sorprende, personalmente les digo, a mí me sorprende que ahora con la Agenda 2030 hay propuestas feministas para todos los objetivos. Y el que tengamos propuestas feministas para todos los objetivos tiene que ver con ese background académico tan fuerte que tenemos. El movimiento LGBT no tiene eso. No tenemos ese mismo background que nos permita mirarnos en cada uno de los objetivos de la Agenda 2030. Y yo creo que ahí es donde yo digo que este grupo, el Women's Mayor Group, puede contribuir de manera muy importante si empieza a pensar a las personas LGBT en sus discusiones. Es decir, apoyar, analizar cuál es la condición de las personas LGBT, cuáles son los desafíos, las necesidades que se plantean en estas discusiones macro. ¿No? No nos interesa solamente defender nuestra identidad del matrimonio igualitario, no. Queremos estar en las discusiones de cada uno de los objetivos de desarrollo. Y eso está costando mucho trabajo, porque no tenemos todo ese capital cultural que el movimiento feminista tiene. Y eso lo tenemos que reconocer humildemente, pero también que ustedes con ese material, con ese capital que tienen, pues tendrían que apoyarnos y realmente construir de manera más colectiva propuestas en donde podamos realmente ser un movimiento único, un movimiento fuerte, unido, que sacuda las estructuras patriarcales, ¿no? Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Thank you so much, Gloria. I think Luisa, it's your turn. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just have a couple of like technical things that come into mind because I think my colleagues have really run through a lot more beautifully than I could about everything that we address on a daily basis in our work. As a lot of you might know, and a lot of you hearing us might not know, the LGBTI stakeholder group was a part of the Women's Major Group. We were adopted by the women's major group before we could be our own walking and talking entity. And that we always have worked together and had conversations. And of course, the LGBTI stakeholder group, as Gloria said, does not have the capital, and I use that in a very broad sense of the word capital, as the women's major group has. So for us, it's always very important to, again, as my colleague said, that even when we're not in the room, that our issues are addressed. Because we do know that it might take some time. You might not have thought about things, just like any other issues when we think intersectionally. You might not have thought about certain things, but the intersectional groups and the different realities have always been there. I don't recognize myself as a lesbian. I recognize myself as a queer person, but queer people have been in all of these spaces since forever as well. And all those issues have been addressed. And as I said before, and in the other question, I don't think it should be the work of the LGBTI groups to always address the LGBTI issues. It should be something that we normalize so much within our own feminist movements that we do not need that one activist or that group of activists to wake up at 3 a.m. to be able to be in a call to remind everyone that you need to remember about LGBTI people as well. So I think that is something that within our own groups and within the women's major group, it should become something that is so normalized that when a binary language shows up, everyone would look and be, is this really necessary? And when we're having a conversation or when we're having different events, is this really necessary? Are we actually addressing this? And I think that having conversations like this one are very important also because of that, because as taking my hat of the outright person and putting my hat as the organizing partner of the LGBTI stakeholder group, we can always get from the amount of materials that you create or the amount of work that you do. We wish to get there one day. It's very aspirational for one day for us to have a secretariat, to do things, to have other OPs and more work being done. But while we can't, it's very important that the women's major group continues to work together with us and also to work together in a way of giving from those resources to those who are doing the SDG work and the Agenda 2030 work from the LGBTI perspective. Because I know we're using an Audre Lorde quote today, but I like the Maya Angelou quote that says that while none of us is free, while not all of us are free, none of us are free. So I think that that is also very important to have as a center of what we're doing, that again, not only LGBTI issues, but because this is our conversation today, it is important that we normalize it. And it is important that we have language workshops that everyone understand why this is important, and that addressing LGBTI issues, including sexuality, including economics, including environmental, including all of these other things, are good for everyone. So even those feminists who do not understand why we're talking about LGBTI rights today, they should understand that bringing those issues forward, bringing our issues forward, bring everyone else's issues forward as well. And it's very important that we include it throughout everything that we're doing. And again, I remind us that LGBTI people were not included in the Agenda 2030, but we find a way to be inside it and in implementations and in whichever way we're able to, because it is important. And it is important that we count, that we have data, and that we have conversations about those things. Because as a colleague of mine likes to say, those who are not counted do not count. And it's important that we sit on the table and that we have sayings, and that we make our own decisions, and that those decisions are not made for us.
Thank you so much, Luisa, for your intervention. And Noeline, is your turn. Thank you.
Yeah, I have to go before 9:30. Sorry, because I have a a session that actually is about 35 groups across the Pacific that are getting together in a feminist community of practice. And for me, that's one strategy. And one way, one of the things that I always love is in these sessions, they're never long enough, right? Because the human discussion, the conversation starts and it takes us a while to warm up, and then someone says something and we spark off each other. And I think it's really important. Another strategy is to keep creating these spaces and to maybe have them in a series, because, you know, a few things that particularly Gloria has said have kind of sparked, you know, little bits that I'd love to take further, and I can't right now. I would just say one of the interesting things, if we're talking about solidarious action, is that I remember a few years ago, Cynthia Rothschild, and I know she won't mind me speaking about this, is that we were sitting kind of at the end of a CSW session and having an angry cry and a rightfully angry cry about something that had happened in that particular year's session. And one of the fascinating things for me, fascinating good and bad, was that the colleagues, you know, my allies and accomplices from the Women's Major Group were majorly celebrating around us for some kind of language that we'd got through. And the interesting thing was that in the final hours, there had been trade-offs. And one of the trade-offs made, which had been happening year after year, was about removal of reference to, you know, sexual orientation and gender identity. And so I think what kind of came home to me was not about, you know, we understand that there are contingent wins and wins that you have on the way, but what was quite concerning for me was about the lack of of understanding, maybe, that might be painful for those of us who were in there and struggling and ensuring that we were looking specifically at issues of sexual rights. And it's happened in various spaces to me through the years. And I think that part of this ability for us to kind of, you know, get into the DNA of organizing to transform gender systems is about being able to say, how does this feel in another person's body? And how is it manifesting as we're doing the work, whether it's in a UN space or whether it's in a family household? You know, every time that a young woman in the collective that I'm in speaks online, I see her cousin brothers and her uncles and others shut her down very quickly. And the minute that she has, you know, put forward something on Facebook, there it is. You know, there is an effort to close that down. So we need to be solidarious in really kind of granular ways, right? In small, nuanced ways, and to kind of, I'm not saying that we can take account and, you know, and be there for people as much as we would like to be in every single space. It's impossible as human beings to do that. But I do think that there are many ways that we can do it better. And I think that's how we get better in Women's Major Group, is by the meaning making that we do. Like I was having a think about what Gloria said earlier, and I would argue that it's not just about academia or not, it's about how we define meaning making. You know, who is allowed to call themselves a technical expert, and who is enabled to take those spaces and to, you know, and to move that set of work. You know, the idea that you can be an organic intellectual and that you can move through the world without, you know, without particular letters after your name. There are many kinds of intellectual sets of work. So I just wanted to kind of end with that by saying that I think that cis hetero, you know, white supremacist imperialist patriarchy is in us and around us, and we scrub it off. Like I keep trying to kind of remind myself and others, it's every day that we're working in these spaces, and some days where we're really stuck in the mud, and other days we feel like we're a little able, you know, to move a little more coherently, and that's part of this lifelong practice, and that don't think just because certain ones of us have it a little better hidden, that it's less in us. I think it's, the welcoming is more about a continual affirmation that all of us are in this set of liberation work for me. And we forget that, I think. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your inspiring words, your knowledge, for sharing your knowledge with all of us. And you have to go. So thank you, thank you, thank you. It has been an honor for